I go to Northeastern University, and I am going to be co-moderating this today with my good friend Ting. I would love it if anyone has any questions throughout this entire thing. Please drop your questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A portion at the end, and we will see what questions we can get to. So I'm going to hand it over to Ting.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you to everyone who I have not met yet, but my name is Ting. I am the communication specialist at MAPA. And I just wanted to introduce everyone today to our program and the topic that we're going to be, that our speakers are going to be presenting on. Generally, it's going to be about media activism, I guess, how the peace movement relates to the media. It's a very fraught relationship, and I think also very important to take note of, considering how powerful the media is, how it's changed the landscape of so many things, how it's wielded as like a propaganda tool, and also how it's sort of like, how people are also kind of like waking up to it. More and more people are turning to like non-traditional forms of media to get their news. And people are also waking up to kind of, how the mainstream media hides things. Yeah. So without further ado, I think Rowan will introduce us to our first speaker.
Thank you, Ting. Yes, I am going to introduce the wonderful Kathy Kelly. Kathy Kelly is board president of World Beyond War. She coordinates the Merchants of Death War Criminals Tribunal. Since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, she has coordinated an international network to assist young Afghans forced to flee their country. She made over 24 trips to Afghanistan from 2010 to 2019, living with young Afghan peace volunteers in a working-class neighborhood in Kabul. Kathy has been an educator for most of her life, but she believes children of war and those who are victims of violence have been her most important teachers. So without further ado, Kathy.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ting, and thank you, Rowan. It's a privilege to be with everyone here today. And I certainly see the Massachusetts Peace Action as being one of the most robust groups in the country. I know that earlier today you welcomed people walking from Maine, heading to Washington, D.C., led by Veterans for Peace. And weekly, daily, you have engaged in outreach in very, very vivid actions of nonviolent resistance, holding accountable those people who are so dangerous for your future and for the security of peoples all around the world. So I'm very pleased to know that Norm's wisdom with regard to media and his many, many years of experience are being brought to bear on so many communities as people think about his most recent book, War Made Visible. And certainly students are to be followed at this point because of the visibility they're giving to the crucial need for divestment. So I'm especially grateful for the article that Norm posted along with Tom Dispatch. War culture hates the ethical passion of the young. War culture hates the ethical passion of the young. And in Chicago, near to where I lived, one of the University of Chicago students engaged in a dialogue while he was trying to kind of hold the line so that security forces wouldn't force their encampment out of the quad at the University of Chicago. He said, we can't follow orders, and we encourage you as police people not to follow orders when the orders are implementing a deadly genocide. And one of the things that Norm points out in his most recent article is that in so many ways, our major universities are functioning like hedge funds. It's kind of a crime spree. It's a racket. These hedge funds invest the hard-earned tuition that families turn over, $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a year for university education, and they invest that into the military-industrial complex and a lot of wealthy real estate magnates' property holdings. And then it turns out that right-wing billionaires, for very lucrative reasons, want to become attached to those investments. And it's almost as though education becomes a side hustle that allows them to make these vast holdings tax-free. So we have a big need to learn from the people who engaged in fossil fuel divestment campaigns, to learn from people with the BDS campaign, and to unite in deep solidarity internationally and intergenerationally to seek divestment. I think about John Lewis, who said, if we want change, we have to determine to be different. We cannot use the same excuses as before. You know, I think also of the novel Lark and Termite by Jane Ann Phillips, in which a war-weary Korean soldier says, the planes always come like planets on rotation, a timed bloodletting with different excuses. And so we get to Columbia University when the students on April 30th took a bed sheet and they wrote on that sheet Hind's Hall, and they renamed Hamilton Hall after 5-year-old Hind Rajab, a little girl who had committed no crime, totally innocent child. And her family had been told, evacuate, get out of your suburb of Gaza City, go to Khan Yunis. The mother and her older sibling, her mother Wissam, set forth on foot, leaving more room in the car for Hind and 2 of her cousins and her uncle and her auntie in a black Kia. The car was attacked. Hind and her older cousin survived. And can you imagine, for over 2 hours, the switchboard operators at the Palestine Red Crescent Society offices 50 miles away were trying to assure these 2 little girls, someone will come to get you. We won't abandon you. Stay on the line. Keep your heads down. Well, the ambulance crew people would have been suicidal if they hadn't tried to coordinate with the Israeli offensive forces, but it was similar to the World Central Kitchen. The vehicles were bombed. In fact, it's almost as though Hind, who was the only survivor after her cousin had been killed by the tank that got so close, she was used as bait for the 2 ambulance crew members. And they were 866 meters away from being able to save that little girl when she was murdered. They were murdered. And it wasn't until 12 days later that Hind's mother could go to the scene and find the remains of her murdered daughter. And so I think students are wanting to be guided by love for that little girl. But of course, the traumatic consequences of war go on for generations. People who are being told to flee from the north of Gaza and go to the south, and people have been told to flee from the south and go to the north, they will have no homes to go to. Now we have the word domicide entering into our vocabulary. And with the elimination of homes, 72% of the buildings that have been destroyed have been homes, residential homes. And with the destruction of the infrastructure and the contamination and the elimination of hospitals and healthcare delivery, it seems quite likely that what Netanyahu, supported by Biden, want to accomplish is pushing out of all Palestinians from their homeland. And so we have students to thank for upholding a moral compass, for insisting that they will not go along with this hideous ethnic cleansing. And Norm, in his recent article, also emphasizes the need for persistence. And I'm sure that many university administrators are counting the days until they can say, bye-bye, everybody go home. but this movement will not go away. And the persistence can deepen through our international connections, can deepen through our intergenerational connections. And Norm is a perfect person, in a sense, to bring to bear the experiences that he lived through during the Vietnam War and so many successive wars in this period of forever wars following 9/11. As a founder of the Institute for Public Accuracy and a co-founder of Roots Action, Norm has been described as formidable. But I want to tell you all that I was with him in Baghdad in a very tense time, just before the start of the shock and awe bombing. And the person I remember was kindly and wise and so very, very thoughtful throughout that tense time. I like Jonathan Kosel's description of Norm. He says he fights the good fight without fear of consequence. And Norm, I think you've taught us that courage is the ability to control our fears, not be governed by our fears or by the fears of others. And so I think this evening's presentation and conversation will help us understand why Jonathan Kosel said that about you. And it will also help all of us to find that strength to link together during these very, very important times for speaking truth to power and about power. So thank you, Norm.
Well, thank you, Kathy. And I love that speaking truth to and about power. People in power, the Pentagon, the top of the so-called defense contractors, they're military contractors, little to do with defense. They know what they're doing, and they know, even if they will not let it get past their numbed sensibilities, they know a lot of the results. So even more important, I think, than speaking truths to power, it's about power, because it's not a vertical, it's a horizontal. And when I think of the profound results of the last several weeks, is that students have educated professors and educated the country about realities and consequences of power. And I want to say, Kathy, that for decades, you have been a great teacher. I know you used to be in the classroom, but your classroom has been in many countries and really around the world. And I know for more than 2 decades, I've just learned so much from you. I think of another great teacher who was able to inspire not only in Massachusetts, where he was based, but around the country and really the world, Howard Zinn. And he talked about how there have been times in history when the situation seemed hopeless, when people were often mired in despair. And then, with great surprise, people discovered and often created the possibilities for breakthroughs and inspiring achievements and saving and nurturing lives. We're in a place, certainly, and I think we're brought here this evening much for this reason. We're at a time of justified despair. When we look at the news, when we listen to it, when we read it, there is such a lack of what we can feel good about, and so much that is discouraging and disheartening and leading us more towards grief, it seems, than any kind of perhaps inspiration. And yet, really, the inspiration is coming, as you mentioned, Kathy, from people who are organizing. Another great person who I was lucky enough to work with, Tim Carpenter from Progressive Democrats of America, based in Western Massachusetts, who we miss very much now. He said that the history books don't mention the spreadsheets, but even though the spreadsheets don't make it into the history books, they help us to make history. It's the organizing that has always made possible everything that we can be proud of in this country: abolition, civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, to end apartheid in South Africa. That was never handed down from on high, from the White House, from the Capitol, from the corporate media. And so here we are, heading into the summer of 2024, and we're 7 months or so into this cascading, daily, horrible flood of news that often keeps the realities largely hidden. And this is where I think we have an opportunity, an obligation, a necessity to end the fog of war that hides from those of us who live here in the United States, who are subsidizing with our tax dollars and often with our silences the massacres that are daily, the mass murder, the genocide that in real terms for real people is taking lives every day. One of the things that I tried to understand when I was writing the book War Made Invisible, and that I've just finished writing a afterword for entirely about the Gaza war that'll be out in paperback this fall, is that when we are told that CNN or the New York Times or National Public Radio are telling us what war is really about, to the extent that we believe that, we are being deluded. We are being betrayed in the sense that journalism is supposed to be the first draft of history, but it's often, and in case of war especially, it's a distorted draft. It's a draft riddled with lies, as much as anything, for what is left out. The terrorizing, the mass murder, the maiming, the traumatizing realities of what we as Americans are engaged in. And mass media really only urge us essentially to do two things: go out and buy things and to vote once in a while. And we do need to buy things and we should vote. But as I was referring to a couple of minutes ago, history is not, or should not, must not be Wonder Bread that we pick off the shelf and consume. History is at its best and at our best what we create moment to moment in real time. I'm really glad to talk about media. And as Ting was saying a few minutes ago, the relationship between progressives and the news media is fraught at best and often in direct conflict. It's the purpose of mass media overall, especially when the United States is engaged in either directly waging war or subsidizing war of an official ally. It's to numb us. It's to convey to us subtly or not so subtly that some people's lives really matter and some people's lives really don't matter. And that is part of what Martin Luther King Jr. referred to as the madness of militarism that's manifested in how we communicate or don't communicate with each other, what is called mass communications. And it's a great irony that never before has humanity lived in a situation where the capacity to communicate is just mind-blowing. You could be in Nepal, you could be in a jungle many thousands of miles away, and as we're seeing, it's possible to have live stream instant communication. And these capacities are used for good and for ill. I know when I went to the Ramstein U.S. military base a decade or so ago in Germany, it was amazing the capacity they had within seconds to relay grainy pictures from Afghanistan to what are called drone pilots in the Western United States, who were then had a chance to push a trigger and kill people who they really didn't know who they were. And so I think about at a conceptual level that technology is, in a sense, neither here nor there. It's how it's used, it's who controls it, what values propel and animate it. And I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of a theoretical analysis of media and then get very nuts and bolts. News media are, as A.J. Liebling said, a critic 60, 70 years ago, the press belongs to those who own one. And we tend to forget that news media are businesses. and that there is a bottom line concern. We've seen that with the layoffs at many newspapers and media outlets, folding and so forth. And as well, we'd sometimes forget that when we approach people in a newsroom, try to contact editors and reporters and producers and so forth, they're real busy. And more time is money. They are in speed up. The newsrooms are often decimated. They're automated as much as possible. And so those journalists have very little time to do journalism, and they have really little time to deal with the likes of us when we are going against the grain of the warfare state. And that, I think, makes it more and more necessary for us to do a lot of journalists and producers' work for them. Because if we present to them something that seems to be not well assembled or not pitched in a sort of a language that they understand, it's much more difficult for us to get through and get our message through. There has been a strain of belief that's been articulated and acted upon at some of the campus encampments from organizers saying, we don't want to talk to the media. They either ignore us or they lie about us. And so we're not going to do news releases. We're not going to put out statements. If we're organizing off-campus protests, we're not going to let media know ahead of time, no matter what it is, even if it's a mass rally. And I think that's a very understandable attitude because so many anti-war protesters, social justice protesters are lied about or were ignored. So that's understandable. People would have an impulse, let's not deal with the media at all. Let's not talk to them. It's understandable. And I think it's wrong. I think it's a terrible mistake. If the Zionist organizations of this country in the last 75 years had that attitude, Palestine might be free by now. Because those who are part of the military industrial congressional militarism complexes, and I say that both technically economic complex and psychological complex, they have institutions that run partly on the basis that it is essential to flood the zone with information, disinformation, misinformation, to try to make it very palatable, even entertaining, providing videos. There's the term disinfotainment. They'll do whatever they can to convey to the public through all kinds of means what their message is. And we can't afford to leave the field to those who are trying to justify the status quo of militarism. And as we, I hope, resolve and rededicate ourselves to moving forward with communication, I think it's really important to both utilize progressive media and reach out to what are called mainstream or mainline media, or sticking to the mainstream political line. And that, I think, requires, as organizations, that as much as we can, we have a functioning, so to speak, media department, a media committee, whatever we want to call it. It's been difficult because, of course, whatever our progressive organizations are, we're stretched for resources. And often it can feel we're running to stay in place. So how to set aside people power and money and ongoing resources for media work, it can often seem to be, well, that's a bit of a frill. We wish we could do it, but we can't. It's really necessary, though, to build relationships. And it sounds sort of like a cliche, but it's just very true. I mean, we know that from organizing. We build relationships with individuals, with other organizations, with some institutions. And in the long run, that's really, really crucial, just as with individuals. As individuals, we build relationships. And we need to build relationships with media outlets, whether it's Common Dreams or the Boston Globe or the New York Times or the local radio station or WBUR, whatever. That's really essential. And often people are moved around on the staff, so it makes it really difficult. Even if last year or the year before we had a good database of who was covering what, they might be covering social issues one year and business the next year and sports the next year, the same reporter. They might have been laid off. They might have gone to another media organization. So I think having methodical way to build, whether it's on a spreadsheet or whatever, a database that we can depend on and that we continue to update is really important. I often think of a train that if a train is at a dead stop and then there was an effort to get it to move, that takes a hell of a long time to get a train really rolling. And if we don't have a media department in our organization that is functional, that has an updated database, then if there is some breaking news that all of a sudden elicits more potential interest from news media, then we have something rolling already. We don't have to build it from nothing, and perhaps by the time our opportunity is gone, that's when we have the capabilities to really make the most of it. So that's one thing that I would emphasize. Another, which might be obvious, is that belligerence towards news media will not pay off, but neither will being too deferential. And media outlets have a responsibility to serve people in their circulation area, whether it's TV, radio, newspapers, or they have a national responsibility. And if they're not fulfilling that responsibility, then perhaps we might say typical Gandhian approach can be taken, where we do the research, we lay out what our concerns are. It's not that hard, especially with Google and so forth, to research what kind of coverage is or isn't happening from a local, regional, or national media outlet, and then present your findings to the editor-in-chief or head producer or whatever. Ask for a meeting. If it's an opinion page issue, then look at what op-eds are getting in the paper and what isn't getting in the paper. If it's news coverage, what kind of coverage is or isn't appearing in that media outlet or on that website. And then sending the information and perhaps requesting a meeting. And maybe that will have an impact the next time we have a protest, next time we have a petition campaign or an occupation or whatever. Maybe it won't make a difference. If we don't get progress, then we would ratchet it up. I mean, if we can picket Raytheon, we can probably picket Channel 5. We might be told, therefore, that we're trying to impinge on their First Amendment rights, which is preposterous. These huge corporations are sitting on the windpipe of the First Amendment, and then they tell us that they're the embodiment of it, where it should not be $1, one voice. It should be some sort of comprehensive village square locally and nationally so people can communicate with each other. And picketing a media outlet should not be out of the question. And if it comes to that, it might be if you picket the local newspaper, that TV and radio will cover it. And then if you picket local TV or radio station, the print outlets will cover it, perhaps for their own nefarious reasons. They want their competition to look bad, but it's worth doing. Maybe obvious, but really important. News releases need to be written in standard AP style. An 8-page news release won't do it. Yeah, you could hot link to all sorts of documentation, but it should be clear and succinct. Whoever you work with who has some kind of journalism training, going to the assignment editor of a news outlet, really important to present something that is digestible in their terms. And it's the difference between form and substance. We could have the most necessary radical substance in a very traditional form. I mean, why not? Consciously or not, a lot of these media outlet producers and top editors, they're looking for excuses not to cover anything that's outside their very narrow parameters. And what are the narrow parameters? They're usually um, mutually defined by mainstream elected officials and mainstream media outlets. And that, as we can see, is extremely pernicious because it means that they keep narrowing the bounds of what they consider to be reasonable discussion, whereas our job, of course, is quite the opposite. I often think of the metaphor of a wall. The corporate media are like a retaining wall to maintain the status quo, but the wall has cracks in it. It's not a 100% thing. We don't live under a totalitarian system. The desk here is wooden, and I'm knocking on it. Um, Not for now, anyway. We have significant freedom of the press that, as I said, as Liebling said, belong to only those who own one. We've got to utilize those cracks in the wall to find them, to discover them, to see, because sometimes we don't know what will get in there and what won't. And as we find the cracks, we widen them, and at the same time, conceptually, just because there are cracks in the wall and exceptions in the coverage doesn't mean it isn't a wall, but the flip side is true. Just because overall there's a propaganda system that functions as a retaining wall, it doesn't eliminate or devalue the importance of us creating more exceptions uh, to the standard quo, the standard messaging of the rulers. And then before I pause, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion. When we think about how so much coverage that is called news is distorted, even at some of the better stories about what we are engaged in, our protest, our actions, our messaging, the quotes might be accurate, they might be out of context, the paraphrases might be wrong, what's left out is sometimes maddening. Okay, that's the news department, that's the terrain. Then there's the opinion section, and it's supposed to be a place where a lot of different outlooks can be heard and can be seen, a flowering of different perspectives. And I think a lot of opinion page editors, while they perhaps take their cue overwhelmingly from the mainstream politicians and other media outlets they try to emulate, they still tend to believe that they are presenting and they do want to present a forum for a wide range of viewpoints. And in contrast to the news stories, which to some degree are routinely frustrating for us, even if we do get coverage, the opinion page is a place where potentially we don't have any filtration whatsoever. It's our 800 words, it's our space. And so we're not getting scrambled or distorted or filtered in a way that distorts what we're trying to say. And I think it's important to make the most of that, whether it's a weekly, it's a daily paper, or whatever, that we really push for writing before, during, and after actions, and just on the basis of what the issues and concerns are, that we have something to say. And as with news releases, we should eliminate any valid excuse for the editors to discount or refuse to run something. I mean, if it's in your circulation area where you live, that's supposed to be a plus compared to them running a syndicated piece from the New York Times or the Los Angeles Times or something like that. And so honing it down to a very tight 700 or 800 words is really, really valuable. And sometimes that'll make the difference between whether it's printed and whether it isn't. There are certain things like traditions, and maybe they are actually valid. If you look at an opinion page article, generally the paragraphs are very short. And there's a reason for that. Whatever the studies tell us, one of the things is that readers don't like really, really long paragraphs. These are really narrow columns. and it's more appetizing to the eye if the paragraphs are short. And it's a good discipline for us because it helps us to see that we've got to be concise. Think of it as, I think Jack Kerouac said, these paragraphs should be like a poem. A poem should be tight. They're not supposed to ramble. So the more we can get everything, or at least more of what we want to say in 800 words, the better. Tighten it up, make it clear, make it understandable. Obviously, avoid rhetoric that most people don't understand, that kind of thing. Mark Twain said something that I think is really great, and I try to remind myself of it. He said, write down everything you want to say and then start writing. And our natural inclination is to write down everything we want to say and then think that we're done. But that's really just the first part, because if we sit down with it later and we scrutinize it again and again, we can continue to improve it. And in terms of getting our message across, that's really, really crucial. One of the things I want to be sure and say is that the timing of news releases is really crucial. I mean, in the olden days, we would put it in the mail and then call. Then there were fax machines. There don't seem to be many anymore. Obviously, email, but media outlets are flooded with them. Most media metropolitan areas have a Bay Area News or something like that, where, and it's important to find out what they are. They specialize, it's an organization that specializes in letting all the media outlets that subscribe to it, which is every TV station, radio station, newspaper, essentially, what is coming up in the days ahead. So we need to get a news release to that place. It's called Timeline, Dateline, something like that. It saves us, or makes it more possible to reach a lot of media outlets, and also to give media outlets as much advance notice as we can. And a last note, they're so flooded that sending an email or even having a phone call isn't sufficient. And we need to go back to them and say, did you get the email? Who might assign this? Who's the assignment editor on duty, and that sort of thing. It's part of relationship building. And when we assume, we often are wrong, because we want to assume that those media outlets will be responsive. And over time, we've discovered usually it is the opposite. So without being too much of a pain in the neck, we really have to nail down that whatever we sent was received, and that they understand what we're doing, and that they are at least making a decision rather than just blowing us off. So with that, I'll pause and look forward to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Norman. And thank you so much, Kat. Oh, sorry, Ting. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good.
Just want, again, thank you guys so much for speaking. And before we move on to the Q&A, I want to do a quick shout out to MAPPA's Public Engagement and Movement Building Group, which is a subcommittee of our nuclear disarmament campaign. It is the group that is sponsoring this webinar today. If you are interested in learning more about MAPPA in general, or learning more about the Public Engagement and Movement Building Group, there'll be information sent out in the email afterwards, and we would love to see some new faces. With that, I will hand it over to Ting to kick us off for our Q&A section.
Thanks, Rowan. Thanks everyone for all your insightful questions. We'll try our best to get through as much as we can. Can I ask that whoever is answering the question, Norman or Kathy or whoever, to try to maybe keep it succinct, just so we can get through as many as possible. I'm sort of cheating and jumping to the head of the queue and asking my question first. But you don't have to give a super long answer. But my question is, media is very hard, obviously, and often it feels like fighting an uphill battle, as you said, sort of relationship building, and also like you have to be really on it. It's a lot of work. I guess I'm wondering, like, for like peace activists, since people are turning more towards non-traditional forms of media, is the effort is the effort worth it, seeing as it feels like it's such an uphill battle?
Yeah, that's a great question. Often we're looking at our limited resources and time and people power, and we have to sort of make that determination. We're often asked, should we be building our own media institutions or concentrate on trying to get our message through and critiquing mainstream? And without being facile about it, I think we need to do it all, that we can't really afford to choose, that there's it's such a complicated country in the US, such a big one. There's so many different people who are attuned to so many different kinds of media. So it's a easier said than done, but yes, it's worth it. It's definitely worth it because we want to build a mass movement, not just speak to cadres.
King, I just want to mention that I think quite often of the people who face such intense risk when they try to exercise their First Amendment rights and speak up. And I realize that, if I try to speak up or speak out an opinion that might not be so popular, it's not likely that someone in my family will be tortured as a consequence or that I'll be disappeared. But then I think of Shireen Abu Akleh, and she worked for Al Jazeera and she was murdered. And I think, is it 160 journalists in Gaza and the West Bank now have been killed for their effort to try to get the truth out? So we know the media is important. Otherwise, the Israelis wouldn't be trying to eliminate the people mediating these crucial voices. And now, of course, Al Jazeera in Jerusalem has been closed down. And I take note that they were the ones who disclosed that when Hind al-Rajab was killed, there were 3 Israeli tanks in the immediate area. And the Israeli offensive forces had said it wasn't us, but because of the aerial surveillance that Al Jazeera was able to do, and later that was followed up on by the Washington Post, it became clear that the Israelis weren't being honest. And so I think it's incredibly important in this time of increasing risk of fascism. I noticed Norman was knocking on wood and saying, well, right now, so far, we do seem to have a fair resilience in being able to speak, but we could lose that if we don't maintain very strong solidarity. And I just want to make that reminder, courage is the ability to control our fears, not to be governed by fear.
Yeah, I think that was a wonderful response, and a lot to consider. One of the questions that we got that I'm particularly interested in is, what are some elements that activists should incorporate into their events to make them more appealing to the media, and what should they avoid?
Yeah, well, the avoid part, of course, violence, hostility that is counterproductive. We know, and I was at a demonstration last night where almost everybody was very peaceful and emphatic, and the 1 or 2 who weren't were pretty much shunted aside. So that sort of discipline of message and also discipline of conduct is really important. And of course, peace marshals and those who are trained in nonviolent action to mitigate against and as much as possible prevent something that actually serves the interests of the war makers. They understand violence, they excel at it, they want violence to come from forces that they identify as peace forces. The messaging is just being real in a way that communicates in human terms. I think it's a crucial question that you're asking, Rowan, and I think it involves being able to bring to the fore what is at stake, what is the core, what is this most about, and it's about human lives. It's about people being able to get in touch with empathy for those they've never met. And to the extent we can articulate that to and through the news media, we can break through some of the stereotypes that get in the way of communication.
Rowan, I spent some time in federal prison, and the Bureau of Prisons doesn't really like to give people lots of sporting equipment. So women would make a big, huge ball. They called it Hoover ball, and it was made out of old rags and whatever people could assemble that could be then thrown over the net. But the idea was the Hoover ball was so big, someone like me couldn't possibly catch it. I'd have to duck and run away. And I think that counsel that says, don't try to throw a ball over the net that's too heavy for someone on the other side to catch. So to some extent, we do have to tailor our message so that it's something that can be heard, not to fudge the truth. But I think it's really important to try to step in the shoes of the people who are our opponents and sort of do a jujitsu in a sense of balancing the person, but also beckoning the person to come closer to the beliefs that we hold. Thank you.
All right, that's wonderful. That leads me to one of my own questions that I was wondering, particularly as someone of the Gen Z. I was wondering, how do you think that the introduction of social media, particularly in short form postings, has changed how people interact with the press? And how has it changed what forms of news people consume?
A lot of it, I think, has been really positive, and the ways in which the corporate mass media can gatekeep information have experienced a lot of end runs. So I think it's very creative. On the other hand, a lot of what comes through various forms of social media has its origins in corporate media. And another thing I would say is that we need to apply the same standards of truth and respect for humanity that we are applying to the New York Times or CBS or NPR to our own social media content and what we find as acceptable. So it's it's a very complex question to which I'm not giving a very adequate answer. But I think on the whole, social media is positive. But on the other hand, as Robert McChesney, who is a scholar of media, has pointed out, technology never saved anybody. And there have been trumpeted claims from the invention of the telegraph to radio to television to cable television and then the internet that the technical advances themselves would bring democracy. But no technology is going to do that. It's really up to human beings and how we use the technology.
All right, that's wonderful. We're gonna do probably a couple more questions here, go until like 7:55-ish. For the next question, my friend Luis, who is also in the public engagement group with me, is wondering about building relationships with reporters and editors. How can we do that more effectively? I know you talked about doing that sort of face-to-face interaction, but really, what can you do to step that up? How do you make those connections?
Yeah, it's such a challenge. I'll just jump in to say that, as is the case, of course, in so many realms of life, the personality is really different. What might really establish a bond with one journalist might just be off-putting and result in rudeness back to us for another. But I think that recognizing how busy they are is really important. And also ask, if possible, would you like an email correspondence? Would you like to talk on the phone? Might you like to get together at a cafe for coffee if you're covering this issue? Uh, to ask the journalist what she or he would like to establish as a means of communication would be really good. And then the other is threading the needle. not stereotyping them or assuming that they're up to no good and want to be up to no good. On the other hand, was it Reagan who said, trust but verify? Don't trust them too much.
So this one I also find particularly interesting, considering how, journalists are people too. So I'm curious, do you believe that journalists should never sacrifice their morals? What extent should they place their own personal ideas and beliefs out on the line, and how much should they, sort of conceal?
I have some thoughts, but Kathy, you've talked to many journalists over the decades.
Well, there were times when journalists would come over to Baghdad, and this was during the time when the pediatrics wards were really a death row for infants. None of those children would go home with their mothers. They would be cradled in the mother's arms until they died. And I remember a group of journalists coming over from the United States, and this was like after, NPR had told us, we will never give you a platform. We will never cover the issues related to economic sanctions against Iraq. And we thought, oh, good, they're finally coming. And they met with us and they said, well, where do you think we should go? And we said, well, to the hospitals. And I remember the main NPR journalist said, oh, we're never going to go to a hospital in Baghdad. We don't want to be duped by Saddam Hussein. And then he said what he really wanted to know about was his kid was really interested in numismatics. His child was a coin collector. And so could I tell him where he could find ancient coins, Iraqi coins? And I honestly, I don't really have much of an Irish temper most of the time, but I wanted to stand up on a table and start screaming. And I'm glad I didn't do that because, we don't benefit anyone by spouting off. But I do think it's incredibly important to keep our vision clear. What is it that's most important to communicate about the situation? And then keep beckoning reporters to come closer. For every person who has a job in the news media that's an important, internationally acclaimed job, there are 10 more that want that job. So they certainly do face risks that their editors are going to say, sorry, we can replace you. But certainly cultivating those relationships is very, very important. And be assured that the news media want young people to start consuming their news. So you're in a pretty pivotal situation.
Something I'd add too is that in general, if they're working for a mainstream media outlet, corporate, and I'd include NPR News, they're working for editors and producers who have a particular set of assumptions that often we don't share. For instance, tacit or not, it's that if you're covering a US war, the assumption among journalists is if you are pro-war, you're objective. If you're anti-war, you're biased. And that is just such a pernicious way that it's like in the air they breathe. And without getting into prolonged debates with them, still, I think we really do need to challenge this idea of objectivity. They don't have objective reporting on whether cancer is good or not. They don't have objective reporting about whether civil rights movement was a good thing. It's not a issue anymore. But when I was a kid, was the civil rights movement a good thing? Well, that was considered to be up for grabs in terms of whether the news media should say it was or wasn't. And objectivity was defined as maybe segregation is good, maybe segregation is bad. So we're in a position of dealing with institutions with some mythology about what objectivity is, and we've got to push them along while recognizing that often we're just at loggerheads in our underlying assumptions. I do want to say before, I know we're about to adjourn, as I mentioned before, and as I think we're just very aware of so often, organizing is so key. We're in such a dire moment right now. And I have to say, as somebody living in California, I wish that we could transplant Massachusetts Peace Action to this state, because we don't have a statewide peace action organization here with just a tremendous vitality and creativity of the Massachusetts Peace Action organization. So I do really want to urge people, this is an organization that we need to sustain. The war makers have their institutions, and we need to build our own.
I wonder, I would like to especially thank Ernie Rosado for entering into the chat a correction of what I said about the number of journalists killed in Gaza. Ernie notes that the Committee for Protection of Journalists said 97 have been killed as of 13 May 2024, 25 journalists arrested, and 16 injured. Thank you for that correction, Ernie.
And the Committee to Protect Journalists has made clear that often these killings are intentionally caused by the Israeli military.
Well, thank you guys so much. We do have more questions, but unfortunately we are almost out of time. So I do want to thank you guys once again for taking your time out of your evening to speak with us tonight. I know I personally really enjoyed listening to you guys. I also wanted to say just one more time that this was sponsored by our Public Engagement and Movement Building group. And also, please, everyone here, remember to follow us on our social media, which is at Mass Peace Action. We are on Instagram, Facebook, X/formerly Twitter, and YouTube, where you can find this video later, and it will also be sent out to everyone who registered. Thank you so much all for coming tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.